What's one truth you wish you'd said out loud when you were younger?
The night was supposed to feel like a victory lap, the kind of evening where the years of grinding, of swallowing comments and smiling through dismissals would finally crystallize into something undeniable. Something that not even my family could brush aside with one of their backhanded remarks. I had worked my way into a promotion that mattered, one of those positions people chase for decades, and I thought a dinner in my honor might finally tilt the balance, even if only slightly, even if only for a single night. We were at a restaurant where the waiters wore crisp black vests, where the wine list had its own weighty binder, and where every dish arrived with the kind of garnish meant to whisper that you belonged here. My colleagues were scattered along the table, faces warm with congratulations, while my parents and my sister anchored the far end, their voices a little louder than necessary, as though they were guests of honor at my own celebration. I had told myself not to expect too much from them, to settle for polite acknowledgement, but the words still landed like a slap when my father, fork in hand, raised his glass and said, "Of course we're proud of you, honey, but let's be honest. Your sister has always been the star of this family." The laughter that followed from his side of the table was sharp, not cruel in intent perhaps, but cruel in effect, because in that moment I felt every eye swing toward me, waiting for me to laugh too, waiting for me to show that I could take the joke. My stomach tightened, my throat dry with the effort of swallowing the kind of humiliation I had known my whole life. My sister Jessica smirked over the rim of her glass, not even bothering to disguise her satisfaction, as if the punchline had been rehearsed between them beforehand. I opened my mouth, ready to steer the conversation away, but before I could, my boss leaned forward, his expression unreadable, and slid a folded document onto the table between the dessert menus. "That's strange," he said, his tone measured, almost casual, but with an edge that made the room tilt. "Because I just fired her today." The silence that followed was electric, like the air before a thunderstorm. My father's fork froze halfway to his mouth, the bite of steak trembling as if gravity itself had paused. Jessica's face drained of color so quickly it was almost comical, though no one dared laugh, not even the colleagues who had been whispering about her smugness all evening. My mother looked from one face to another, her confusion plain, as though she had been invited to a play but had never been given a script. I felt heat rise in my chest, not triumph exactly, but something close, something dark and vindicating. I had known Jessica's job wasn't as golden as she claimed, had known she exaggerated her position and her influence, but hearing my boss deliver the verdict in front of everyone was like watching a curtain rip away from a stage. For a second, I thought I might pity her, but the memory of every graduation party where she stole my thunder, every holiday where my achievements were brushed aside so her potential could be celebrated, kept my sympathy buried deep where it belonged. She stammered, her lips parting, then pressing shut, her hands twitching at the tablecloth as though she might grab the paper and make it vanish. "Fired," my father finally managed, the words strangled in his throat. His eyes darted from my boss to me, as though I had orchestrated the entire scene, as though this humiliation must somehow trace back to me. That suspicion in his stare was almost familiar, like a reflex he couldn't control. I didn't speak, not yet. I let the silence grow heavy, let the tension press down until even the clinking of glasses seemed indecent. My colleagues shifted uncomfortably, unsure if they should excuse themselves or remain witnesses to what had become less a dinner and more a family autopsy conducted under restaurant lighting. Jessica pushed back her chair, the leg scraping the polished floor with a screech that made everyone flinch. She muttered something about needing air, her voice brittle, and disappeared toward the exit, leaving her half-finished wine and her half-destroyed reputation behind. My mother began fussing with the napkins, as though folding linen could stitch back dignity. My father cleared his throat, struggling to regain control of the room, but the effort only highlighted the fracture. My boss, unbothered, leaned back and sipped his drink, watching me with an expression that told me this was not the end of the revelation, merely the beginning. I realized, sitting there in the wreckage of my own celebration, that my promotion and her downfall were not separate stories, but intertwined, that some invisible line connected them. and that tonight was only the first tug on a thread that might unravel everything. The question was whether I wanted to pull harder to see how much more truth could be dragged into the light, or whether I would let my family keep clinging to the illusion that Jessica was untouchable. When the waiter arrived to ask about dessert, no one answered. The silence was thicker than the air, and for once, it was Jessica who had no words, Jessica who had no applause, Jessica who had no spotlight. For me, that silence was louder than any toast, and yet, deep down, I knew it carried a weight I wasn't ready to name. The drive home after the promotion dinner felt like a slow march through wet cement, with the city lights dragging across the windshield in long ribbons while my phone pulsed on the console, like a tiny heartbeat that refused to settle. Because the group thread from work was an awkward trail of congratulations glued together with emojis and polite exclamation points, and the family thread had gone ominously quiet except for my mother's one brave attempt at normalcy about saving the centerpiece. Yet the private messages from my sister slid in almost immediately, each one fragmentary and impatient, accusing me of setting her up, asking what I told my boss, insisting this would never have happened if I had stayed in my lane and remembered who had the real talent in the family, which would have been funny if it hadn't been delivered with the kind of conviction people reserve for religion and tax refunds. I kept driving because the streetlights are honest in a way families rarely are, and while the car moved, my mind replayed a loop of the moment my father's fork froze, the bite of steak stranded in midair like a tiny flag planted on the territory of my humiliation. And I could almost hear the hush of the dining room as everyone did that mental math people do when a joke curdles into something meaner, so by the time I parked, I knew this wasn't going to be a night I could sleep through. Not with the buzzing in my pocket and the cold certainty blooming behind my ribs that the firing wasn't a clean cut, but a tangled root system that ran straight under my feet. Inside, I kicked off my shoes and opened my laptop, because when your life is being rewritten in other people's voices, the only reasonable act of self-defense is to collect receipts. So I started with the email my boss had slid across the table like a playing card, the formal notice with phrases that bristled, gross misconduct, conflict of interest, breach of confidentiality. And then I pulled up my work folder and scrolled through the drafts of the product roadmap I had shepherded through 3 quarters of pushback, budget games, and last-minute pivots, the same roadmap that had been mysteriously leaked to a competing vendor 2 months ago. The same vendor that had arrived at a pitch meeting with a slide so eerily similar to mine that my stomach had knotted as though I were watching a magician take a rabbit out of my hat and sell it back to me at double the price. I thought then that it was office politics, some sales guy trying to look shiny in front of the executive team, and I told myself not to be dramatic, but tonight, with Jessica's messages escalating into capital letters and accusations that smelled like fear, I opened the version history that no one remembers exists until it is too late, and there, in that quiet little ledger of timestamps and edits, a familiar personal Gmail address had dipped into my private draft on a Sunday afternoon when I was at my mother's kitchen peeling potatoes for her pot roast. Because family duty always arrives dressed like generosity. I stared at the line of text and the name tied to it and tasted that metallic shock that isn't quite anger and isn't quite grief, a kind of chemical reaction produced by finding your worst suspicion wearing someone you know like a coat. Because Jessica had accessed the file through a link I sent to our father weeks earlier, a harmless share so he could see, for once, what I actually did besides show up on holidays without a casserole, and if there is a moral somewhere it is that the road to betrayal is paved with helpful screenshots and the assumption that people want the best for you. My father had forwarded the link to Jessica with a note that made my throat go tight, something about how maybe she could coach me on presentation polish, because I had the substance, but not the sparkle. And from there it was a tiny hop to her uploading a cleaned-up version to her cloud and pinging a friend at the vendor, a favor that turned into an invoice, a side door that became a spotlight, and if the numbers had broken my way at the time, I might have ignored the whole thing as the cost of doing business, but now the narrative snapped into place with an ugly click. When her next text arrived, an almost pleading line about how I shouldn't make this a thing, because she had been trying to help me look more senior, and it just got messy. I laughed in a way that wasn't pretty and typed back something long and slow that did not include insults or threats, just a meticulous list of timestamps and the exact path her login had taken through my document, followed by a cheerful note that I would be forwarding the audit trail to the legal team in the morning because clarity is a kind of mercy even when it feels like a blade. Then, fueled by the mix of pettiness and principle that gets you through nights like this, I executed a tiny revenge so tidy it felt like tapping a chess piece into place by filing the formal credit correction for the last quarterly deck, complete with embedded proofs and calendar receipts, so that the internal newsletter would, next week, replace her name with mine on the bullet point she had tried to colonize, which would not destroy her, but would strip a ribbon from the dress she wore to every room like an identity badge. The apartment felt too quiet after that, the kind of quiet that lets you hear your own heartbeat and second-guess the choice to escalate, because there is always a version of me that wants to keep the peace and let people underestimate me, thinking that a smooth surface guarantees safety. Yet just as I was pouring water and telling myself to breathe, my screen lit with an unfamiliar number, and a single image arrived, a cropped screenshot of my roadmap draft with a watermark I had never seen, labeled in neat corporate font with a name that was not my sister's, a name from my own company with a title 2 floors above my boss, and underneath it a message, so short it felt like a dare, telling me to ask how the vendor got into the room in the first place. Which would have been helpful if the sender had signed it, but anonymity has its own twisted flavor of generosity, and I stood there with the glass half full, staring at the little bubble on the screen, while somewhere in the corridor, a neighbor's door clicked shut, and the night, which had seemed already full to bursting, quietly opened another door I had not known was there. By the time the sun dragged itself over the rooftops, painting the blinds in pale strips of light, I was still awake, the unanswered message glowing faintly in my inbox like a match left to smolder, and, though exhaustion clung to me, the questions burned hotter than any desire for rest, so I pulled on a sweater, brewed coffee strong enough to taste like penance, and decided to start untangling the web that had been spun around me. A web that now clearly had more architects than my sister alone. At the office, the morning carried that strange hush that follows scandal, the kind where conversations stall when you step into the hallway and emails arrive with a politeness that is almost apologetic. And in those gestures I sensed the ripple effect of Jessica's firing, because gossip is currency, and no one wants to be caught with counterfeit bills. I made my way toward my boss's office, the document from the night before folded in my bag, my nerves stretched tight, and when I stepped inside, he gestured to the chair as if he had been expecting me, his expression that mix of irritation and grim amusement reserved for people who already know too much, but keep digging anyway. He confirmed what I had pieced together in fragments, that Jessica had not merely stumbled into a mistake, but had deliberately funneled information to a competitor, and worse, she had done so under the illusion of mentorship, framing it as if she were helping me refine my material while she stripped it for parts. What struck me, though, was his choice of words when he admitted that my promotion and her downfall were linked, that the exposure of her actions had come at precisely the right moment to elevate me into the vacancy she left, and though the logic was sound, the timing too perfect, I could not shake the suspicion that I had been maneuvered into a spotlight designed for someone else's purposes. He leaned forward, lowering his voice as though the walls themselves might betray him, and said that higher levels of the company had long suspected leaks, that Jessica was convenient but not the only channel, and that my sudden rise was not simply merit recognized but strategy executed, a strategy in which I was both the beneficiary and the pawn. I left his office with a hollow in my chest, clutching the confirmation of her guilt, but also carrying the heavier weight of being used, because victories that arrive wrapped in manipulation never feel like triumphs. They feel like traps with better lighting. At lunch, 2 colleagues cornered me by the vending machine, offering their version of sympathy laced with curiosity, and one of them slipped that he had seen Jessica meeting privately with a senior director at a bar near the office weeks ago. A man known for playing both sides of the chessboard depending on which one promised the quickest win. That name matched the watermark on the screenshot I had received, and suddenly the puzzle had sharper edges, its pieces fitting together in ways I had dreaded. It meant Jessica had been a pawn too, though she never admitted it, and whatever she had done to sabotage me was entangled in larger currents. Currents my father would never acknowledge, because for him the story was simpler. I was ambitious to the point of cruelty, and she was the child who only ever needed encouragement. When I returned to my apartment, my father was waiting in the lobby, his posture stiff, his eyes thundercloud dark, and, before I could protest, he followed me upstairs, closing the door behind him with a slam that vibrated through the frame. He accused me outright of orchestrating Jessica's downfall, of feeding my boss the ammunition to fire her, of stabbing my own blood in the back just to climb one rung higher, and in his voice was not just anger, but disappointment. The old refrain that I would never measure up if I did not learn to be more gracious, more loyal, more like her. I wanted to laugh at the absurdity, to remind him that the evidence was not my invention but Jessica's own fingerprints, but the words jammed in my throat because what good was evidence when the jury had already been bought by decades of favoritism, when the verdict had been written in childhood? He paced, his voice rising, until finally he demanded to know whether I was proud of myself, whether this was the kind of recognition I had been chasing all these years, and I stood there, exhausted and trembling, knowing that the truth would never pierce the armor he had forged around his golden child. That night, when he left with a glare that promised no reconciliation, I sat in the quiet of my living room and felt the weight of a choice pressing down, because I could either bury the trail, let Jessica carry the scandal alone, and preserve what remained of my family's fragile unity, or I could push forward, expose the director whose shadow loomed over both our careers, and risk burning every bridge left standing. The decision was not simple, because revenge is never clean, and justice rarely comes without collateral damage, but as I scrolled through the audit logs once more, tracing the subtle handoffs between Jessica's accounts and corporate emails that were far above her reach, I knew the truth was heavier than silence, and I could no longer pretend that all of this began and ended with her. The cliff edge had arrived, and I was already standing on it, staring down into the wreckage of loyalty, ambition, and betrayal, with only the question left of how far I was willing to fall. To see the rest of the story laid bare. Morning arrived with that sterile brightness offices use to disinfect scandal, yet beneath the gloss of hallway greetings and the fake bustle of calendar invites there was the damp smell of something rotting behind the drywall, which worked in my favor because rot draws attention when you knock at the right spots, so I spent the early hours at my desk building a careful architecture of truth that could not be dismissed as hysteria or sibling drama, a dossier that braided the audit logs. The vendor's mirrored slides, the watermark from the anonymous screenshot, and the sequence of calendar blocks that placed the senior director and my sister in the same bar on the same evenings when my drafts changed hands. And while I assembled it, I added one small flourish that would sting in exactly the right place, because righteousness is fine, but a little theater helps the medicine go down when your audience prefers sweet lies to bitter facts. I scheduled a meeting with compliance under the dull subject line of clarifications, attached the sanitized packet, and in a separate envelope that I hand-delivered to their administrator, I tucked the version with the name spelled in bold and the timeline printed so large that no one would accuse me of vagueness, since people who benefit from fog always pretend the horizon is to blame. Before lunch, I executed the kind of revenge that pretends to be courtesy, which is my favorite variety, by drafting a polite email to my father's weekend foursome. Those men whose opinions he treats like weather reports that determine what he wears and how he feels, and I framed it not as a takedown but as an apology for the awkwardness at my promotion dinner, which I suggested had left the impression that I basked in the humiliation of a sibling, when in reality I wanted to ensure rumors did not outrun the facts. So I attached a single page with the audit trail, the vendor comparison, and a brief note thanking them for always encouraging integrity on and off the course. A phrase I knew would land because those men worship rules the way some people worship the sunrise, and I hit send with a steadiness that surprised me, then sat back and pictured the moment on the green when my father's favorite companion would clear his throat. squint at his phone, and ask why the man who preached fair play at every tea time had allowed one daughter to borrow another's work and sell it across the fence. The point was not to destroy him, though a shred of humility would not kill him. The point was to suspend the easy myth that he had raised a star and a shadow, because once a myth cracks, it keeps cracking as long as you tap in the right place. My sister called within the hour, voice raw and splotchy, insisting that everything had spiraled, that she had been coached, that the senior director had promised it was normal to share drafts if it made the company look good. And I told her that normal is a word people use when they want you to forget the bill comes due, then asked her to put in writing what she had just said, which she refused to do with the kind of panic that confirms more than any confession. So I pivoted to Grace with a blade inside it and offered an exit ramp that would save a sliver of her future, because despite everything I did not want to watch her drown if she could still stand. Telling her that if she signed a statement for compliance naming the director who opened the side door and the vendor who walked through it, I would ask my boss to mark her termination as eligible for rehire after a defined cooling period. Not because I believed she deserved it, but because symbols matter to hiring algorithms and reputations, and she knew it because she went very quiet, then asked whether I would swear I was not doing this to trap her again, and I said that the only trap was the one she kept building under her own feet. In the afternoon, the senior director finally appeared at my desk with a smile that would have looked kind if it had not been pasted on with the desperation of a man who smelled smoke and could not find the exit, and he asked for a quick word, which I granted in a conference room with glass walls so clean our reflections looked like ghosts eavesdropping on the living, and he performed the oldest routine in the book, pretending concern for my emotional well-being, implying that the attention around my promotion might be a lot for someone not used to the glare, and suggesting that misunderstandings about documents and drafts sometimes happen when teams move fast. Then lightly proposing that perhaps the best way to protect my long-term prospects would be to keep the escalation inside our lane, which translated to letting him manage the cleanup behind closed doors where he could lock it and swallow the key. I listened without interrupting, then slid my phone across the table and pressed play on the voice memo from the bar, a recording I had not mentioned to anyone because the anonymous sender of the screenshot had also forwarded a clip in which his laugh and my sister's voice braided into something unmistakable. And while it was not cinematic, no grand confession, just casual lines about how the vendor would love the polish on her deck, it was enough to make his hands stop mid-gesture and his eyes flick toward the door, which is when I explained, gently and with a patience he did not deserve, that I had already filed the packet with compliance, that I had blind copied legal on the memo, and that by the time the sun set the board's audit chair would be paging through those pages with the leisurely thoroughness of a man who collects antique scandals and polishes them on weekends. For dessert, because a day like this deserves a flourish, I sent one more message from my personal account to the anonymous number, thanking the stranger for the nudge and promising to keep their name out of it. Then I drafted a short internal post for the strategy forum where I often share dry updates, writing an innocuous note about how integrity is not a department but a habit, and how roadmaps travel faster than cars when people leave the doors unlocked. And within minutes the thread filled with tidy corporate affirmations that read like wind chimes in a hurricane, which made me smile in a way that felt like oxygen returning to my lungs. I thought the day had given me all the clarity it could until my phone vibrated again and a new file arrived without a greeting, a scan of a non-disclosure amendment bearing the senior director's signature and, to my surprise, my boss's initials alongside his. Countersigned 2 quarters ago when our vendor list was reshuffled, and under the signatures a clause that carved out a quiet exception for pre-competitive collaboration, the kind of phrase that sounds harmless until you realize it opens a gate big enough to drive a truck through, which left me staring at the screen with the dawning recognition that the rot had never been just behind the drywall. It had been poured into the foundation, and if my day's clean strike of revenge had knocked a satisfying chip from the facade, the next swing might bring down more than I intended, including the ladder I had just climbed. The last episode of this mess began not with shouting or fireworks, but with the subtle dread of an email flagged urgent. A summons to the top floor where the carpet swallowed your footsteps and the windows framed the skyline like trophies meant to remind you how small you were, and I carried with me the weight of the file I had built, the voice memo tucked on my phone, and the lingering question of whether I was about to be congratulated, punished, or maneuvered into yet another role in someone else's play. The board's audit chair greeted me with the politeness of a surgeon who has already sterilized the scalpel, and across the table sat my boss. Calm in that way men become calm only when they have rehearsed the outcome and believe they know all the lines. Which unsettled me more than anger would have, because it meant this was not chaos but choreography. The chair explained, with the patient diction of someone who prefers his truths wrapped in layers of insulation, that my dossier had been reviewed, that my sister's conduct was indeed grounds for termination, and that the senior director had been asked to resign effective immediately, but then he added the sentence that made my stomach tilt. That the non-disclosure amendment I had uncovered was not an aberration, but a sanctioned experiment, signed off by several layers of leadership, including my boss, who now leaned forward and reminded me that survival in this business often requires dirty hands, and that my sudden promotion had been timed not only to reward my work, but to position me as a cleaner face to absorb the shock if the experiment leaked. I sat there, pulse hammering, torn between the bitter satisfaction of having been right about the depth of the rot and the hollow sting of realizing I had been chosen less for my merit than for my malleability. Because when someone wants to use you as cover, they prefer a woman with a record of being underestimated, one who has spent a lifetime being told she is the shadow to her sister's star, and I thought of my father at the dinner table. The way his fork had frozen, the way his eyes had accused me of orchestrating everything, and how in a twisted sense he had not been entirely wrong, though the orchestra was larger than even I had known. I asked the chair what would happen to the clause, whether the vendor relationship would be severed, whether the rot would be burned out or simply wallpapered over, and he gave me the kind of answer that could have been a sigh, saying only that adjustments would be made, and that my role would be critical in communicating stability to the teams, which translated to smiling in public while swallowing questions in private, a job description that left me colder than the skyline beyond the glass. That evening I met my parents for dinner at a small Italian place my mother liked, because she clung to rituals even when the ground shifted under them, and my father was quieter than usual, though not contrite, just subdued in the way men are when their authority has been dented in front of their peers, and while the waitress poured wine he cleared his throat and mumbled something that might have been an apology, but emerged as an awkward acknowledgement that things have been difficult, which my mother quickly dressed in lace by reminding us that family survives storms if we hold tight enough. Jessica did not come, though her absence filled the table as palpably as her presence once had, and I wondered whether she sat at home drafting a statement for compliance or whether she had already begun crafting a new version of herself in another city where no one knew her name, because people like my sister rarely vanish. They just shift shapes until someone is fooled again. I raised my glass when the pasta arrived, not in triumph but in defiance, and said, to finally being the disappointment who got it right, which made my mother wince, my father stare into his plate, and the couple at the next table glance over as if they had caught a line from a play they wished they had seen from the beginning. Yet, even in that moment of dark wit, I felt the unease settle deeper, because the email scan of the amendment still glowed in my inbox, unanswered, a reminder that my boss had not been blindsided by Jessica's fall, but had orchestrated the timing, and perhaps even the exposure, to clean house in a way that left him untouched while leaving me standing in the open, and though I had secured a measure of revenge against my sister, against my father's blind favoritism, against the director who thought me easy prey, I had also been drafted into a game that did not end here. Later that night, alone in my apartment with the city humming beyond the glass, I replayed the voice memo, not because I needed to hear it again, but because I needed to remind myself that evidence can be both shield and shackle, and that sometimes being clever enough to win a round only guarantees you a seat at a table where the stakes keep climbing until someone finally folds or someone finally bleeds. So I ended where I began, suspended between vindication and suspicion, carrying a promotion that now felt less like a crown and more like a collar, knowing my family would never rewrite the story in which Jessica was the star, even as her light dimmed, and sensing that the company would never stop weaving strategies that required someone to take the fall. The cliffhanger remained unresolved, not because I lacked the courage to leap, but because the ground itself kept shifting, and as I closed my laptop, I whispered a truth I could barely admit aloud, that revenge had satisfied me for a heartbeat. But the real battle was still unwritten, waiting in the silence between the keystrokes, daring me to decide whether I wanted to be the pawn, the queen, or the player who upends the entire board.